Исторический момент.
Welcome to the third module in Doukhobors in Canada. In the second module, we looked at significant events the Doukhobors experienced in Russia, such as the burning of arms. In this module, we describe the journey of the Doukhobors from Russia to Canada.
You may have heard of Leo Tolstoy, the Russian author, philosopher, and peace activist who was considered by many to be one of the greatest novelists of all time. Along with his friends and followers, called Tolstoyans, he campaigned on behalf of the Doukhobors, alerting the Russian, British, and Canadian governments about their persecution. This lobbying made it possible for the Doukhobors to find a new home outside of Russia.
Tolstoy and his followers admired the Doukhobors for living in accordance with their own ideals of Christianity: equality, nonviolence, communal living, and spiritual simplicity.
But they weren't alone in their admiration for the sect. The Quakers, a religious society of friends that originated in the 17th century, shared similar values as the Doukhobors. Based in Britain and the US, they advocated for those living in poverty, facing oppression, and suffering persecution. Their support, along with Tolstoy and his followers, was integral to the successful Doukhobor immigration to Canada and in the first critical years of their settlement.
While Tolstoy was writing about the persecution of the Doukhobors in esteemed newspapers such as the Times of London, his followers were petitioning the Russian government to allow the sect to immigrate. Their combined efforts proved successful. In 1898, the Doukhobors were allowed to leave Russia and told never to return. In the words of one Russian senator, "I myself see no impediment to granting the Doukhobors permission to immigrate, for the removal of such an unruly and dangerous element beyond our borders would be most desirable."
The first step in the Doukhobor immigration was to choose a new home. While Canada was a desirable destination for the majority of the sect, it wasn't the only place considered. At some point, Mongolia, Manchuria, Texas, Hawaii, and Argentina were all seen as possibilities. After negotiations with the Russian government, it was agreed in 1898 to send the Doukhobors to Cyprus. A shipload of over 1,000 Doukhobors landed on the Mediterranean island. Unable to adapt to the hot, arid climate, many became ill from malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. Out of the 1,126 Doukhobors that immigrated to Cyprus, 108 died during the first year of settlement. Fortunately, the survivors were included in the immigration to Canada to come in 1899.
Prior to setting sail for Canada, Tolstoyan, Quaker, and Doukhobor delegates traveled there to negotiate the immigration with officials. The government of Canada, having stolen land from Indigenous people during colonization, was eager to accept new settlers, especially those who could withstand the prairie climate and could farm the land. Although invitations to immigrate were typically reserved for Western and Northern Europeans, the Doukhobors were accepted due to their stamina, agricultural skills, and the need for farmers to settle Western Canada.
The government initially guaranteed the Doukhobors full religious freedom, exemption from military service, and the right to live communally without external interference.
Funding for the immigration was raised primarily by the Tolstoyans and Quakers, and by Tolstoy himself, who donated all the proceeds from his novel, Resurrection. Taken together, the funds were not sufficient to cover all the necessary costs, so the Doukhobor communities also had to contribute whatever they could to the immigration effort.
Preparations for the voyage to Canada involved hiring 2 steamships, the Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Funds were used to purchase tickets for each person and to buy food, building materials, and medical supplies. In 4 transatlantic crossings in 1899, over 7,500 Doukhobors endured the month-long voyage to Halifax. Tolstoy's son Sergei, as well as a few select Tolstoyans, traveled with the Doukhobors to Canada with the aim of helping them settle in the New World.
The first Doukhobors chosen to emigrate were the Holidansky from the Wet Mountains region. Having endured more torture, imprisonment, and death than other settlements, their circumstances were the most critical. When they arrived in the Georgian port of Batum, they had to wait for several days before they could sail. A local businessman allowed the 2,000 Doukhobors to stay in an unused warehouse. Sergei Tolstoy, witness to the way the Doukhobors organized themselves, wrote to his father describing them as a unique people, remaining calm and orderly and without complaint about their difficult conditions.
In order to board the ship, every Doukhobor was required to give their passports and transit permits to custom officials. But according to Leo Tolstoy's friend, Leopold Sulozhitsky, who accompanied the first shipload of Doukhobors, not all complied. One young man, who was desperate to avoid military conscription, had snuck on board the ship dressed as a girl. In another instance, Sulozhitsky hid a young military conscript under his bed in his cabin, only to be discovered by Sergei Tolstoy. Understanding the severe punishment this young Doukhobor would face if discovered, Tolstoy did not give him away and later wrote that he secretly admired his resolve.
For most of the Doukhobors, emigration to a foreign country was a heart-wrenching affair. They were leaving the homes and communities they had worked so hard to build, in the only country they had ever known. Adding to the heartache, they had to say farewell to friends and relatives who had chosen or were pressured to stay behind. It was a grief that would be passed down for many generations afterward.
Both Sergei Tolstoy and Leopold Sulozhitsky kept detailed journals of their journey with the Doukhobors to Canada. In one such entry, Sulozhitsky offered his impressions of the Doukhobors leaving their homeland.
The shore slowly moved away from us as the ship gradually picked up speed. As the ship departed, the Doukhobors stood with their eyes full of tears facing the land where they grew up, a land where their grandparents and great-grandparents lived and died, where their leaders are buried, where they had to bear so much suffering and accept so many heavy losses. Their voices joined in the mournful sounds of a psalm, a cry of despair for leaving their motherland and wondering what lay ahead for them.
It's hard to imagine what it would be like to sail towards a strange foreign land. The trip itself was often rough, and for a people unfamiliar with the open seas, it must have felt terrifying. In another journal entry, Sulozhitsky reflected,
Once in the open seas, most of the passengers suffered from seasickness. Everyone was lying in their bunks. The air was filled with loud moans and sighs. One could hear women reciting prayers. Others were terrified by the rolling of the ship. A wave would strike and everything shuddered, jumped, and whirled.
Each voyage had cases of illness and a few deaths. Conducting a sea burial proved to be a particular hardship for Doukhobor families of the deceased. Even though the burial was accompanied by prayers and psalms, watching a body wrapped in cloth slip into the ocean's depths was strange and uncustomary for them.
The grief of these sea burials was offset by the joy of births. In one such instance, during the fourth and final sailing in 1899, a baby girl was born and given the name Hope, or Nadezhda in Russian. And hope is what they had, as the Doukhobor refugees made the best of a difficult situation.
Tolstoy described life on the ship as generally cheerful, with people baking, cooking, washing, and children running about. The decks were typically crowded with people waiting patiently for boiling water, porridge, and bread.
Adding to the communal joy was a sense of wonder at crossing the Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea, and Atlantic Ocean for the first time ever. The odd sighting of dolphins especially brought delight to both children and adults alike.
After a month-long voyage, the east coast of Canada was finally within sight. It's easy to imagine what a relief it would have been to see land and know that you would soon be able to walk upon it. The Doukhobors stared at their new country in silence, wondering what might lie ahead.
The first shipload of Doukhobors on the Lake Huron were required to spend time in quarantine on Lawler's Island, off the coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Stepping onto that piece of land was by all accounts a great reprieve and cast away any doubts the Doukhobors might have had. Feeling at ease, smiling and chatting for the first time in over a month, they were able to hold their bowls of soup without fear of spilling them all over themselves.
During this quarantine, the doctor designated for the Doukhobors found them to be in surprisingly good health, given that the journey had been long and arduous in an overcrowded ship with over 2,000 passengers. The quarantine officers reported never having seen such a well-kept ship in Halifax Harbor. Sergei Tolstoy, who traveled with the Doukhobors across the Atlantic and into the Canadian Prairies, later commented,
"One cannot deny their loyalty to the tenets of their faith, their perseverance in actually living their faith, and their readiness to suffer for it. This they have proved by their actions. They are honest, sober, industrious, courteous, and clean living. I am happy that I have spent almost 6 months with them and have come to know them. And not only do I not regret having participated in their emigration, but I am proud to have had at least a small part in bringing it about. It is a pity that these good people have left Russia, but their emigration was unavoidable."
Reportedly, when the Lake Huron landed in St. John, New Brunswick, crowds could be seen from a distance lining the shore. They waved their hats and umbrellas with a roar of voices expressing their welcome, to which the Doukhobors reciprocated with a psalm. The Montreal Daily Star reported that, quote, "The decks of the vessel presented a picturesque appearance. Men and women of all ages, the men garbed in sheepskin coats, fur leggings, top boots and fur caps, and the women dressed in red plaid-like skirts, woolen comforters, and sheepskin coats," end quote.
As they disembarked, the Canadians welcomed the Doukhobor children with sweet treats. Soon after, they were on trains for the long journey to the prairies. By 1905, over 8,000 Doukhobors had immigrated to Canada, while around 12,000 Doukhobors from both the small and large party remained in Russia.
In the next module, we explore the Doukhobor settler experience on the Canadian prairies, where they established communal villages and farms. But much like in Russia, they were forced to contend with a government and society often at odds with Doukhobor beliefs and lifestyle.
Видели той муки,